President Trump formally accepted the Republican Party's nomination on the fourth night of the RNC. It marked the first time in modern history a president has done so from the White House. His nomination came as the nation faces a triple threat of crises. Nearly 1 million people in Louisiana and Texas are still without power after Hurricane Laura barreled across the Gulf Coast early Thursday morning. The deadly storm left widespread destruction and severe flooding in some areas, and the danger is not over. Arkansas is under a state of emergency after being lashed by damaging winds and flooding. Tornado watches are also in place. Meanwhile, calls for social justice are growing louder, with ongoing demonstrations against police brutality taking place across the country. People have been protesting for several days in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in the wake of a police shooting of a black man Sunday. All this as the coronavirus continues to claim more American lives each day. The U.S. has passed the grim milestone of 180,000 deaths. Some 5.8 million cases have been confirmed since the pandemic began, more than anywhere else in the world. Against that backdrop, the theme for the fourth and final night of the RNC was Land of Greatness. Speakers once again praised President Trump's leadership and touted his handling of the pandemic. They portrayed him as a law and order president and claimed the country would be a more dangerous place under Joe Biden. The president's eldest daughter, Ivanka, defended her father's record and his leadership style before introducing him to close out the convention. The pair delivered their speeches live from the South Lawn of the White House to a crowd of nearly 2,000 people. Very few members of the audience wore masks, and there was no social distancing. President Trump listed many of the policy changes made during his first term and touched on plans for a potential second term. He presented himself as the law and order candidate while criticizing Joe Biden's record. Mr. Trump argued that his Democratic challenger would, quote, allow a radical movement to destroy America. Here's more of what you may have missed.
My fellow Americans, tonight, with a heart full of gratitude and boundless optimism, I profoundly accept this nomination for President of the United States. Despite all of our greatness as a nation, everything we have achieved is now in danger. This is the most important election in the history of our country, and this election will decide whether we will defend the American way of life or whether we will allow a radical movement to completely dismantle and destroy it. How can the Democrat Party ask to lead our country when it spends so much time tearing down our country? Joe Biden is not a savior of America's soul. He is the destroyer of America's jobs, and if given the chance, he will be the destroyer of American greatness.
Joe Biden is being told what to do by the radicals running my former party, the same radicals trying to install him as their puppet president.
They will dismantle our institutions, defund our police, and destroy our economy.
Democratic politicians have surrendered our streets and our institutions. When it comes to your safety, your family's safety, and the safety of all Americans, there's no other choice. You won't be safe in Joe Biden's America. We can have 4 more years of President Trump, or you can have no safety, no justice, and no peace.
It is clear that a vote for Biden and the Democrats creates the risk that you will bring this lawlessness to your city, to your town, to your suburb.
Let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter. Hi there, Caitlin. So typically we hear incumbent presidents in these moments take the opportunity to lay out their second term agenda. What did we hear tonight? And specifically, did we hear plans regarding how the president would tackle the COVID pandemic in the second term?
Hi, Elaine. Well, we can safely say that both parties came to some kind of agreement. Donald Trump said today this is the most important election in the history of the country, and that there is a stark choice between the two candidates, to which the Biden campaign and Democrats have been saying that they very much agree with that. Tonight we heard 2 speeches in one. The first half of the speech was geared towards showing what the president believes to be his accomplishments and comparing them to things he talked about in 2016. The second part of the speech was very much an attack against Joe Biden, trying to show Biden as someone who has become what he called a Trojan horse, who is going to be a radical leftist, essentially, is the message that they were trying to send there. I think what was interesting about tonight is, and we've been talking about this all week, about how the pandemic is factoring into the speeches and the messaging tonight. Tonight, the president did address it, and he also addressed what he and the administration are doing. But it was a message kind of geared towards claiming victory already, essentially. You could also notice in the crowd that the crowd of over 1,000 people weren't wearing masks, they weren't socially distanced, so it kind of gave the aura of a kind of a pandemic that was over, a very celebratory notion at the end. So while he did mention it and did express condolences to families who have been suffering, the message here was very much kind of going beyond that. He also talked a lot about the economy and how the economy was before the pandemic hit, talking about those numbers. And we know that Republicans, looking at our polling, are largely supportive of that message. We heard Mike Pence last night say this election should be about who you think is best to handle the economy. And we see in our polling that a majority of Republicans feel like they are financially better off now than they were 4 years ago. And they believe that this downturn is just temporary. So that kind of gives the context for this speech that was very much geared towards touting what the president believes are his accomplishments, going after Joe Biden, and also speaking to a base of support that has been with him since the beginning.
You know, the president and other speakers, as we noted, repeatedly talked about the need for quote-unquote law and order. And at one point, there was a compelling segment from a woman named Ann Dorn. She's the widow of a retired St. Louis police captain by the name of David Dorn, who was killed after protests in St. Louis. I want to play a little bit of what she had to say.
How did we get to this point where so many young people are callous and indifferent towards human life? This isn't a video game where you can commit mayhem and then just hit reset and bring all the characters back to life. David is never coming back to me. He was murdered by people who didn't know and just didn't care. He would have done anything to help them. Violence and destruction are not legitimate forms of protest. They do not safeguard Black lives. They only destroy them. President Trump understands this, has offered federal help to restore order in our communities.
Caitlin, how does her story fit into the Republican narrative that the president is the candidate of law and order?
Right. We've been talking about how the president would address racial injustice that we've seen in the form and response to racial injustice that we've seen in protests around the country, the latest of which are happening in Wisconsin right now after a shooting of a Black man by police officers. This message, though, is speaking to a very specific strategy by Trump and Republicans, which is not to focus on the protests, but to focus on the violence. And we've heard Democrats say that Joe Biden today and Kamala Harris today, that the protests should be applauded and the violence should be condemned. But Trump wants to lump them all together because he wants to portray a nation that is being in these cities that are having lots of riots and violence, and kind of portraying a nation in chaos under Democratic leadership in these cities, he says. There is, of course, the question of, okay, well, Trump is the president now, so what is he doing about it? And he really didn't answer that. At the end of the speech, he said that on November 3rd, when I'm reelected, things will be safer, you will be safer. But 4 years ago, he promised to be the candidate of law and order and to restore law and order. He also said that I alone can fix it. So a lot of the things that he talked about in 2016, he's still talking about now, and not much, at least at that front, has changed. And there was an interesting split screen with protests going on outside of the White House and the celebratory nature that the president portrayed inside on White House grounds tonight.
Well, the president's speech was short on policy proposals for a potential second term. He did spend a lot of time going after Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. Do we know, Caitlin, does that help him with anyone outside of his base?
I think what Republicans have been trying to do all week is not only speak to the base of their party and get them excited for November, but also to try and reach those disaffected Republicans, some of the Republicans who may have supported Trump in 2016 and have now since left or are thinking about leaving the party. We saw in 2018 that Republicans in the suburbs especially migrated away from the party and towards Democrats. And so a lot of the messaging that you heard this week, especially talking about federal judges and Supreme Court judges, talking about abortion, talking about so-called cancel culture, and a lot of these themes that the president was trying to push, and other messengers this week as well, I think were really aimed at trying to get those voters. And that's why we see him focusing so much on violence and this law and order campaign. Now we'll see if it works. In 2018, we saw a similar push, except it was focused on the border and caravans that he was claiming would be taking over. And voters didn't necessarily buy it. In fact, Democrats won the House. So we'll see how this plays this time around, but that is certainly the goal by Republicans this week, is to try to get those voters back.
Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now I want to bring in Leslie Sanchez. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst. Hi there, Leslie. So throughout the convention, we heard people of color talk about why they believe President Trump has helped them. And it was interesting. We heard the HUD Secretary Ben Carson at one point speak, and he referenced what Caitlin brought up, the shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin of Jacob Blake. And I want to play for our audience what it is that Secretary Carson said regarding that. This was a shooting that took place in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And then I want to play for our audience how the president referred to the events in Kenosha. Let's listen to that.
Before I begin, I'd like to say that our hearts go out to the Blake family and the other families who've been impacted by the tragic events in Kenosha. As Jacob's mother has urged the country, let's use our hearts, our love, and our intelligence to work together to show the rest of the world how humans are supposed to treat each other. America is great when we behave greatly. In order to succeed and change, we must first come together in love of our fellow citizens. History reminds us that necessary change comes through hope and love, not senseless and destructive violence.
When there is police misconduct, the justice system must hold wrongdoers fully and completely accountable, and it will. But when we can never have a situation where things are going on as they are today, we must never allow mob rule. We can never allow mob rule. In the strongest possible terms, the Republican Party condemns the rioting, looting, arson, and violence we have seen in Democrat-run cities all, like Kenosha, Minneapolis, Portland, Chicago, and New York, and many others.
So, Leslie, very different tones with those mentions of what happened in Kenosha. Why those different approaches there from Secretary Carson, who mentioned Jacob Blake by name, not so, though, with President Trump?
Secretary Carson certainly spoke in his own authentic way, right? A very compassionate plea, understanding the nature of the family, speaking directly to the family, and kind of our hearts go out to the family. The president's talking specifically when he's talking about mob rule, and he's talking about the escalation of violence. And if you look at some of the surveys, people are coming back, that's where the disconnect is, Elaine, where Republicans and many people are feeling that this escalation of violence is not about social justice and not about the dramatic reforms that need to take place, but a disconnect between those two elements. And that's why you hear the tone of those two messages. The reality is, it's going to have to come together both in terms of seeing these reforms and the president acknowledging those reforms. And it's really significant that he did talk about that tonight's audience got an opportunity to hear some of the compassion about Blake. Some will say he never went far enough, but that's distinctly different from what the original program, you can imagine, was looking like, and whether they were even going to touch on these issues. Many people didn't expect the president to talk about the virus and the pandemic to the scale that he did. So these are just kind of showing the recalibration that's happening in real time with the convention.
So, we had Indiana Senator Mike Braun earlier on CBSN, and towards the end of the conversation, he talked about how he thinks this issue, this law and order campaign, is going to be a winning issue for President Trump. And this morning, Kellyanne Conway, the president's outgoing advisor, his departing counselor, said, quote, "The more chaos and anarchy and vandalism and violence reigns, the better it is for the very clear choice on who's best on public safety and law and order." She said that on Fox News. What's your assessment of that, Leslie?
They're absolutely right. That's where they see Republicans are getting kind of the growth in their support. This is not necessarily where the president is trying to peel back those swing voters and those independents. This is really activating not only the base of voters, but a lot of voters who are on the voter rolls who just don't engage in elections year after year. They are either disaffected voters, they could be conservative Democrats. They're in a lot of those states, and they came out in 2016, and there's a deep consensus within the campaign that they're going to come out again, and now it's a much more strategic message. And this law and order message is about the respect for the police, is about criminal justice reform to an extent. It's about finding a way to do it in balance. I don't know that message comes out that way, but behind the scenes, that's the tone of where they want it to go. So as the president is moving that, I do think you're right. I think there is some of this scare tactic that you're hearing in Kellyanne Conway. This is the kind of the gloom of what happens when it's out of control. But nobody wants to see an escalation of violence, regardless of your party of politics. You want to find a way to bridge that. That's about leadership. And I don't know that we have an answer there, but that's the distinct difference between the two.
Yeah, a lot of people are looking for that leadership right now. Leslie Sanchez for us. Leslie, always great to see you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
And joining us now is Isaac Stonefish. Isaac is a CBSN contributor and senior fellow at the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations. Hi there, Isaac. I want to start off by playing something for you that was aired during the Republican National Convention and get your take on it. Let's listen.
The U.S. attorney announced charges against Dr. Charles Lieber and 2 Chinese nationals today.
A systematic decision by many of our country's most powerful leaders to sell out America to China.
China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man.
A 2013 trip to China getting new attention this morning, not for what Joe Biden did, but for who he brought with him.
As the threat from China grew larger and more threatening, Biden seemed to grow more accommodating to the Chinese government.
Questions about money he made from foreign business dealings while his father was vice president.
And they knew they can get to Joe Biden's heart through his son, Hunter Biden.
They hoped to raise $1.5 billion. One person who did not want to talk about it, Joe Biden.
When it was already clear China had lied to the world in ways that hurt the world about a deadly outbreak of the Wuhan coronavirus, Biden was still flacking for the Chinese government.
They're not bad folks. But guess what? They're not a competition for us.
China would prefer Joe Biden.
All right, so Isaac, this is your area of expertise. Give us your assessment of what we just saw there.
Very effective propaganda. If I watched that 5 or 6 more times, I would start believing that we faked the moon landing and that vaccines cause autism.
What's the reality of what we saw with respect to that video?
The reality is, for a lot of these things, a lot more complicated, and both the Republicans and Democrats have switched between engaging with China and challenging China. And one of the things the video doesn't talk about at all is the real important difference between China, the country, and the ruling Chinese Communist Party. The video also completely overlooks all of the times that President Trump has called Chairman Xi a friend and has tried to work with Xi, and all of the lines he's tried to put together on the U.S.-China trade war and a trade deal. Not to say those are bad things, but there's just a whole huge amount of reality that that video conveniently overlooks.
So I just want to be very clear here, because we did show it again. With respect to the specific kind of implications or allegations in there about ties between Joe Biden and China, give us your sense. What's the veracity of some of those claims?
One of the reasons the video is so effective is that it doesn't say anything that's 100% false. Biden was vice president for 8 years. Hunter Biden, his son, has business links with China, as do Trump and a lot of other Republican politicians, and frankly, a lot of people in America. It's has been our largest trading partner for much of the last decade. So the issue is not that anything is a complete bald lie. The issue is that it's very misleading, it's very one-sided, and it's very alarmist. We saw the cracking of the Statue of Liberty. We saw this music that wouldn't be out of place in a horror film. We saw the lulling tones of Tucker Carlson, sort of a advertisement for him potentially trying to be press secretary. We saw all these elements that try to make people believe a certain way about Biden's relationship with China. And frankly, it was really, really well done. I hate to give them credit for it, but if you don't know very much about the relationship and you see this video, it raises your heart rate and makes you think, gosh, I shouldn't trust that guy. And like I said, it's a very, very misleading take, but unfortunately, probably a very effective one.
Right. So essentially, the bottom line here, the reality is much more complicated than what was presented in that video, it sounds like. Isaac Stonefish for us. Isaac, thank you very much for giving us your assessment. Appreciate it.